trade. Today's seminar is extra special as it is also part of our new short course, Making Trade Policy Inclusive, a new initiative seeking to create a network of professionals and researchers committed to greater inclusion in international trade. It is driven by a partnership between the Institute of Development Studies, the UK Trade Policy Observatory, and Interanalysis at Sussex. Now, international trade and its impact on poverty has in fact absorbed huge amounts of research over the last 2 decades. But it appears that we have still failed to provide a very definitive, sort of general answer to the question, does increased trade reduce poverty? While there are proven aggregate benefits from international trade on average, considering the full extent of micro-level effects can often be challenging. And this is even more important as we face increasing uncertainties as a result of the pandemic, the conflict, as well as various economic disruptions. We asked this very question in our new IDS working paper, Inclusive Trade, 4 crucial aspects, where on trade and poverty, we ask, what is it that we know about the relationship between increases in trade and poverty? Today's seminar presents an overview from this paper, highlighting policy implications to help maximize the gains from trade, to share them more evenly, and to help avoid clusters of bad consequences, even as we see averages are improving. I have the pleasure of welcoming today Professor Alan Winters, founding director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory and co-director of the new Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy at the University of Sussex. And let me add, one of my personal favorite economists working on trade and development. I'm also extremely delighted to be joined by 2 stellar discussants, Professor Robert Koopman, Chief Economist at the World Trade Organization, whom I had the great fortune to meet about 7 years ago, and his ideas stuck with me, and it's really fantastic that he was able to join us today. We've also been joined by Mohammed Razak, Director, International Economics Consulting UK, and former head of International Trade Policy at the Commonwealth Secretariat, where I was able to meet him and learn a lot as a PhD student now quite a while ago. So without further ado, I'd like to pass to Alan to tell us what is it that we know about the relationship between increases in international trade and poverty. Over to you, Alan.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Amrita, and thank you everyone for coming, and to Bob and Razak for taking the time to add to the conversation. Let me share my screen, which I think will work okay. We tried it before, and I want to talk about trade and poverty, which is one aspect of inclusive trade, one that greatly exercised us in the 1990s and 2000s, and is still hugely important. And I want to talk firstly about sort of macroeconomics, and Amrita has already mentioned this a little bit, and then to talk a little bit about the way we think about it as microeconomics. I am an economist, as you can see. No, we're not going anywhere. So, trade and income, GDP. There's a positive relationship. We can argue about whether it resides in levels or whether trade actually changes the long-term rate of growth. My own view is that most of the evidence that we've got suggests that trade policy raises the level of income, what you can get out of, given technology, given population, but likely does not do anything to the long-term permanent rate of growth. But that is somewhat contentious. But there is a strong positive relationship. And how do we know? We have case studies of particular countries. Some of you may remember the World Bank's Growth Commission, which was mainly policymakers, although with a couple of professional economists. They looked into a number of case studies, concluded that engagement with the world was a very important part of the cocktail of policies that gave you economic growth. And we have all sorts of econometric studies. Growth regressions, where we regress the rate of growth on all sorts of things. For any of you who are economists, it's a pretty complicated process and involves instrumental variables as a way to try and pin down causation. We argue extensively about this stuff, but again, the general impression of almost all that literature is there's a positive relationship. We also have time series studies, look for changes in trade policy and ask what happened after them. Again, almost always we find that growth, GDP increases. And we've got event studies looking at very particular liberalizations of trade, and when we can finally do Brexit, a disliberalization, a deliberalization of trade, which already seems to be having quite strong negative effects on UK trade with Europe. Now, I think these studies are fine, but they are all averages. And they're averages over space because we average them over lots of countries typically. They're averages over periods because you need long periods if you're going to do time series stuff, and you'll have changes in government, changes in technology. And also, in a sense, the most important for today, they're averages over people. And there certainly are, therefore, exceptions. And what I think one has to remember is that finding an exception, say, aha, here's a liberalization that didn't improve growth, doesn't prove that on average, increasing trade does not help growth or incomes. The overall result is very strongly grounded in this multiple evidence base. We do know now, we've learned that one of the really important initial conditions for trade helping trade growth or trade liberalization helping the level of income is that resources need to be able to move. And remember that that is sometimes moderately uncomfortable. So it's not to say that every trade liberalization is costless for everyone. It's not. On average, it is beneficial. We have a tiny amount of evidence that maybe low-income countries have found it more difficult to adjust to liberal trade regimes. I'm happy to talk about that in the questions and answers. But it's mixed evidence, I think I would say. So we can't conclude that there's no effect, but we can say, look, there is still a remaining country. One of the absolute regular results we get on about sort of 490 out of 500 studies I once counted is that trade liberalization increases productivity, and productivity is the basis of incomes. The big problem with that, so far as growth is concerned, is you might make your industry more productive, but if at the same time you make it smaller, you don't necessarily end up with more income. So while I think one needs to think about trade liberalization and productivity, you also need to make sure you are thinking about the aggregate size of the economy. Okay, that's all I've got to say about sort of the aggregate, except to observe that when we look at poverty at an individual level, we find that it's strongly related to average growth level, average income levels. I haven't time to go into this slide very carefully, but there are 4 different measures of poverty. This is a study across about 67 events of trade change, trade policy change, where we have good household measurements at the beginning and good household measurements at the end, conducted by Art Cray in the World Bank. And the bottom line, FGD, Foster Greer, Thorbecke index, for those of you who are interested, is the head count of poverty. What is the proportion of people, or even the absolute number of people in poverty? The blue bar is what percentage of the changes that we observe between these different events can be explained by changes in their average income levels. And for headcount poverty, it's saying about 80%, in fact, a bit more than 80% of the difference between these poverty, these liberalization events that you can talk about, 80% of the difference in outcome for poverty headcount is actually related to the average income of the economy. it really matters. But of course, it's not everything. It's unfortunate, perhaps, for economists that not everybody's average. And so you then need to get inside and ask about the microeconomics, right down to the individual level or the household level. We can think of a number of, well, we can think of two main routes through which trade liberalization might affect poverty. One is the effect that it has on prices and markets in the economy. And the sort of questions we need to ask is, do border price shocks, you think about a trade liberalization, that's reducing tariffs or relaxing quotas, typically more goods will come onto the market, more people are able to buy more goods, but the question is, does it translate into lower prices for poor households? Are markets created or destroyed? Are you, by opening up trade, destroying a market, or are you creating a market? And we have examples of both. There's a question about how households can respond to these new prices. Have they got the capacity? Do they need capital and lack the ability to invest in new opportunities? And then also, of course, we know there are spillovers. One of the big attractions of liberalizing agricultural trade over the 70s and 80s turned out to be that the farmers got richer, and typically they spent most of their money on goods produced by the local poor or employing household servants who were from poor families. So the spillovers there were very pro-poverty reduction, it turned out. And then you can also start to worry about, say, does trade liberalization increase vulnerability? Maybe average income increases, but you've got a bigger chance of strong negative shocks. The second route is through employment, wages and employment. And the really critical question is, does trade liberalization raise wages or employment? And that depends partly on what's liberalized, which trade liberalization is not a single homogeneous activity. It varies, of course, from sector to sector, commodity to commodity. A really critical issue in this question is the nature of the labor market, how the labor market works. And I'll come back to that because I think it's the most important element. It's critical because on the whole, people's bundles of consumption are pretty similar. So you drive the price of wheat up, for instance, in a poor economy, nearly everyone is consuming products related to the price of wheat. There's a sort of generalized squeeze there. But when it comes to how people earn their livings, they are much more concentrated. Some people earn it on a farm, other people do it providing services, other people have informal employment in the cities, for instance. And so households differ more in the way they earn their living than in what they spend their money on. So really, if you're trying to ask, where is there a vulnerability to poverty from a trade reform, concentrate on how people earn their livings, at least as a first cut, because that's where the bigger differences between households come. There might also be issues about transitional employment. You don't immediately jump to a new equilibrium, sunlit uplands, and that it might take time to get there. I want to talk about one particular study which is often quoted. It's very interesting. It's a very well done study, but it's often misinterpreted. And it concerns reforms to India's trade regime. Essentially, India got into a real balance of payments trouble, and the IMF, as part of the conditions for its loans, said you've got to reform your trade policy, get these tariffs down from 80, 70% down to something more sensible. 60 or 30. This paper by Petya Topolova looked at real consumption and poverty rates by region in India, which are 77, or district, 450. And essentially what she asked was, over the period from before to after the trade liberalization, what happened to incomes or real consumption and poverty in those regions and districts. And she tried to explain them by employment-weighted tariffs. She asked how exposed is this particular district to a tariff change when it depends what they produce and what the changes in tariffs on those goods were. And also fixed effects, essentially saying, look, every district is unique, and therefore there are going to be differences between districts that we can't explain, but we need to recognize. Two things to say about this study. First, it's based on exposure to imports. And secondly, it is what we call a difference in difference study. It's looking at the difference over time, over the reform, and comparing those differences between different districts and different regions. And one of the effects that means in the results is you get relative effects, not absolute effects, and I'll explain that in the next slide. Petier's results were those districts, regions that were exposed more to import competition had a relatively worse poverty outcome. In other words, it looked as if it was better over that period to be isolated from trade, insulated from trade, than to be trading extensively. The problem is we don't quite know what that implied for absolute levels of poverty or absolute levels of real consumption. Sort of the way we think about it is the following, a little simple diagram, sort of positive changes up here at the top and negative changes down here at the bottom. And we're looking at exposed districts and we're looking at sheltered districts. And the sort of story is, well, maybe the change in GDP, change in real consumption was negative in the exposed areas and positive in the sheltered areas. And if that was the case, you'd say, look, maybe this trade stuff is a bit overrated. But what actually Petier is able to do is identify the difference between them. This area here that I've identified with the arrows. And because all she's doing is comparing one district with another, actually, the story could really be this, that everybody gained from the trade. It's just that sheltered areas gain more than exposed areas. And if you're a policymaker, you may wish everyone to have exactly the same proportion of benefits, but actually you'd pretty much settle for everybody getting 3% and some people getting 10%. So it's important to remember that this is a really excellent piece of work, but you have to be a little bit careful about interpreting it. What was going on, Petier has tried to look at this, and it was mainly through agricultural wages or the returns in agricultural areas. And she found that the harm, that the relative harm that districts suffer mainly seemed to go with a lack of mobility. Either a lack of mobility between sectors, moving out of agriculture into other sectors, or regionally, being able to move to areas that were booming. Now, this mobility is a big issue for the poor, but essentially it turns out in Petier's work that it seems to explain most of the difference between the regions that did well and the ones that did relatively poorly. And India has got statewide labor laws, so she was able to look, comparing states with flexible as opposed to inflexible labor laws. And she found that actually where labor laws were more flexible, the effects on poverty were less marked, less, relatively speaking, less adverse. It's also worth pointing out in another exercise published separately, with less good data, admittedly, she asked about what happens if I, instead of saying trade exposure is a function of imports, what if it's a function of exports? And there she found that exposure to trade was relatively good for poverty relationship. So she was sort of getting at the idea, if you were an import competing sector, import competing region, trade liberalization is moderately tough. If you're in an export sector, exporting region, trade liberalization is pretty much good news. And then what I want to say for the last 5 minutes is, in a sense, an elaboration of that. I want to go back, first of all, though, just to, for those of you who aren't economists, this is how economists like to think about the world. And I want to talk about the labor market. I will very briefly explain this. I'm looking at wages against employment. And we've got a demand curve for labour. The higher is the wage given everything else, the less firms are going to want to employ labour, or indeed the less incentive, indeed, even, well, let's just say the firms have got less employment incentive. And trade liberalisation, said it increases average income. Typically, it's going to move the demand for labour out from this D to D prime. Now I want to think about an economy perfectly integrated within its region, but with no ability to move labour in or out of the economy. The labour supply is fixed here at what I've called S. When demand moves up, the equality of demand and supply fixes the wage, the price of labour, and the level of employment. And when demand moves up, if the level of employment can't change, the wage goes up. This implies that everybody in the labour market benefits by a relatively small amount. Quite a big bit in the way I've drawn it, but typically by a small amount. And I want to contrast that with the other possible outcome, and that is exactly the same set of demand. It's exactly the same sort of diagram, same change in demand. But now imagine you can get infinite amounts of labour in and out of your economy at this fixed wage. In other words, if the wage in your region goes up a little bit, people come in from outside. Then we find that the wage, of course, is pinned down by the fact that there are always more people who are willing to work for that wage, but employment increases. So in this case, the wage for everybody goes up. And in this case, the wage for many people doesn't change at all. And some people get from implicitly no job into some job. In other words, a few gain a lot. And which of these applies in a labour market is really important for the way that effects of trade shocks are shared. And we can think that, actually go back, a lot of economies in a sense are rather like this, not able to bring much labour in and out. That's the inflexible labour laws that Topolova talked about. And this might be geographical segmentation. It's difficult to move. You think about the Philippines, many islands, large economies, very big distances, India, ethnically diverse countries where it's difficult for someone in one region to get a job in another. And in other words, what we find is if you are in a sort of pretty closed economy where labour cannot move in and out, when that economy goes downhill, you go downhill with it. If you are in a region that's doing very well, when the demand for labour goes up, if more labour can't flood in, you do very well. And this is exactly the result that Topolova found. We can also think about segmented labour markets between sectors and firms, where labour is a specific factor. True of a number of skills. You work in one sector, but you can't work in another sector. And it is possible in these cases that, in fact, the workers who are rather specific to an industry or even to a firm get to share in any rents. So if the price of the product goes up, wages can go up because the firms are doing very well. And we can sort of combine these sector-specific and geographically specific things exactly in the thing that I talked about implicitly a few minutes ago, which is if you're in a region that is really suffering from import competition, life is tough. If you're in a region that has, because it got a different composition, export competition, it can sell more into the world, you do pretty well. Now, I briefly just want to mention a further dimension, if you like, of this distinction, and that is heterogeneity. We've become more and more conscious, I guess, over the last 20 years that firms are different from each other. Within any industry, we find the difference between the most and the least productive firms typically factors of 50, 60 in their productivity, absolutely massive. And we do know that typically in most countries, exporting firms are larger and more efficient. Now, if you are a large, efficient firm making lots of money, you want to stay like that. And one of the margins you can really work on is searching hard. You've got resources and incentives to search to get better workers. They get better pay, you're better at selecting them. And it may well be that because trade typically helps stronger firms through the export route, actually what we find is even within a sector, trade can be a bit unequalizing. Better firms employ better workers who do rather well. Weak firms employ weaker workers. They may even go out of business. But even if they don't, the workers they've got don't do so very well. If you can't move between the successful and the unsuccessful sort of subsectors, then indeed poverty effects are concentrated. I can talk a little bit about employment. Just let me say, finally, if you go back to that model with horizontal labor supply, you always get more labor. The question is, who gets the new jobs? And a very interesting study, now quite old, by Alejandra Nikita, simulated what happens in Madagascar if there's a boom in the textile sector. And he said, well, I presume that they'll employ more people of the sort that they employ now. And when he looked at the people they employed now, the answer was these were not people who were the sole earners in an unskilled family. Textile firms were fairly much urban, in urban areas. They typically were employing the second workers out of households, and often these were households that were really quite well off because the primary worker was doing rather well. In other words, you might have a boom in employment, but if you're interested in poverty, you do need to ask, actually, does that affect the poor? And with that, I've exhausted your patience. So thank you very much. And I'll hand back to Amrita.
Thank you so much, Alan, for the very clear overview of what is it that we know about trade and poverty. And I think that is an excellent basis for further thinking on the question. Now I'd like to invite our discussants. So first, I'd like to invite Robert Koopman, followed by Mohammed Razak, to give us a sort of reflection on Alan's presentation. Robert, over to you.
Thanks, Amrita, and thanks, Alan. I found the presentation excellent overview of the literature and very insightful. And Amrita, the paper is very good. I thought that covered a number of very important dimensions. I've prepared some slides based on the presentation and the reading. I'll skip some of the slides and extemporaneously add some elements to it based on my experience. So my comments, well, first of all, what I want to do, you can see my slides okay? Yeah, good. No, here we go. I think it's important if we're going to think about inclusiveness. Alan's given you a very good overview of the economics. Since I'm at the WTO, I thought it would be useful to sort of reflect on what's the mission of the WTO and the trade agreements. And you can see in the slide, I've highlighted some of the elements of the preamble to the Marrakesh agreements creating the WTO. And I think people often forget this, but the whole idea, and by the way, my new boss, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, reminds us of this all the time. And that is, it's to raise standards of living, ensuring full employment and a large and steadily growing volume of real income. There needs to be positive efforts designed to ensure that developing countries and the least developed secure a share of growth in international trade commensurate with their needs and of their economic development. To do this, the WTO's mechanisms mainly are to reduce tariffs and other trade barriers. Okay, but it's also very clear. I'll get to that in a second. Another preamble that I'll use. But, the idea is that, trade liberalization can address poverty. It can focus on labor, not labor, and, allows some of these developing countries to access global growth. And I can tell you, excuse me, just for a second, it's been pretty successful at getting many developing countries to be able to tap into global markets. It's been much less successful at getting least developed countries to tap into global markets. So here's the other preamble that I wanted to talk about. And this was from around the launch of the Uruguay round negotiations and what the WTO in the end could do. And this is noticing or recognizing that trade plays that one particular element, and that the task of achieving harmony between these policies falls primarily on governments at the national level. And what the trade agreements are trying to do is bring coherence internationally on these tariffs. But domestic policies matter. That's what all this means, right? Domestic policies are really important. And ministers never thought that trade policies alone were going to be able to do this. And that's really, I think, very critical because it's often overlooked. And I've been involved in trade policy negotiations for about 40 years now. And it's very interesting when you get into those negotiations, the debate typically focuses on trade is pitched by pro-trade folks as it will solve all your problems. And then but the anti-trade folks basically pitch trade's causing all your problems. And the reality is trade's not a magic bullet, and it's also not a magic poison that's going to kill you. It's not going to solve all your problems, and it doesn't cause all your problems. And I think Alan has really given you a nice granular view of how some of these different analytical ways to think about the problems come to the fore in our economic thinking. We can measure them. When we do measure them with very clever techniques, we find that there is mainly positive results in the aggregate, but trade theory has told us for a very long time that there are distributional aspects. Now, I'm going to deviate from my slides a little bit to tell a story. And this is before my job at the WTO. I worked for a place called the U.S. International Trade Commission. It's an independent U.S. government agency. And part of what we were supposed to do was to do analysis of trade policy changes negotiated by USTR or suggested by Congress and prepare public reports. And we'd have public hearings. And this gets a bit to some of the outreach and engagement with the communities that's covered in the paper. And what we found is that participation in our outreach and engagement, usually through hearings, there'd be a public announcement, we'd invite people in. And the people who came in, unsurprisingly, if you've read Manker Olson, were those who had a stake in the fight, right? So they were the ones who came in, and basically you'd get mostly pro-trade folks coming to us, and then you'd also get some labor unions and folks like that coming in saying that, there are some they'd say there are these adverse effects solely caused by trade. Now, my job as chief economist there was to analyze from an economic perspective and, use some of the tools that Alan just described there to articulate what the impact of these policy changes might be. And this is more of an insight, not on the outreach to the public, but the mindset of the negotiators. So we knew from an economic perspective in the early 2000s that we were seeing big differences in the impact of trade agreements by region in the United States. We did report on sector impacts, so that was pretty clear, but we saw it happening in region, and we also saw different labor categories being either positively or adversely affected, and that filtered through with the consumption and the wage impacts to different households. So I went to USTR and to House Ways and Means and Senate Finance and said, hey, you know what? You ask us for these reports, you give us the terms of reference, but you don't ask us for these things. And I think you should. And their response was, no, thank you. It's a national policy. We negotiate this at the national level. We want to know what the aggregate gains are. The other stuff is not of interest to us. And we had written some reports to illustrate how we could do this. And we thought it was pretty powerful looking at, say, the textile and apparel sector as we were opening up our textile and apparel through the agreement on textile and clothing. And we could see that there were big, significant community effects, almost perhaps a less sophisticated Arthur Dorn and Hansen insight on what was happening to workers, to these communities. And we were basically told, no thanks, trade policies negotiated at the aggregate level. Now, what's interesting is that USTR, under this current administration, is asking my old organization, can you actually give us more granular insights? Will you engage with the academic and the policy community to give us, to find out how you can provide these insights? And my colleagues called me up and said, geez, Bob, we were trying to do this in 2002 to 2005, and we got no traction. So I'm going to kind of skip some of these slides because they're just making the same point that Alan did. That there have been pretty significant gains, particularly since the creation of the WTO, across all economies. And there's been significant differentiation at the same time that there's been aggregate reductions in extreme poverty. So we at the WTO like to say, these are good things, right? As trade, globalization, integration, the various mechanisms have been very powerful at helping to reduce poverty, essentially by allowing countries that don't have strong domestic demand to tap into external demand and to basically sell to consumers that are richer than them, and maybe not sell final products because they can now use global value chains to do that. Interestingly, developing countries, particularly least developed countries, have not really had to change their tariffs very much, although they will complain about that. They've had to bind more of their tariffs, but they haven't had to reduce their tariffs as much as the developing some of the G20 developing countries, particularly China, have had to reduce theirs a lot. But since 1996, you can see on the average tariff levels, there's quite a bit of differentiation where the developed world has just an average tariff of 2.7%, whereas the G20 developing has a tariff about 3 or 4 times that, and developing countries almost 5 times that. So there was lots of flexibilities in the WTO. Now, one area I think I will disagree with Alan. I do think that trade does have an effect in a comparative static way on reallocating your resources to increasing your output. But I think the biggest elements of trade is the knowledge spillovers, the foreign direct investment that trade helps generate and spur, and the know-how spillovers that create a more dynamic convergence. So I do think it will speed up your growth rate. It will help your country if you're well behind the global frontier and you have big barriers. You lower those barriers and you open up to the global economy, and I think you start to close the gap. But trade in and of itself is not going to guarantee that those gains are shared in any way that might be considered equal. And they probably shouldn't just be actually equally shared across all sectors. You have to have incentives, I think, to spur people. But then you need a safety net. And, we did some work with the IMF and the World Bank a few years ago that basically argued that you really do need to create a safety net that helps you adjust not just to trade policy changes, but to changes in technology, changes in demographics and the geographic distribution of your workforce or your households, and changes in consumer preferences. Now, let me close on this. Can trade commitments be designed to better address such issues as gender, MISME, and poor underserved populations? And I would say probably yes. If you look at certain element, what you see is that, well, I'll give you an example from the environmental area. Tariffs on green products, depending on how you define green, are higher than tariffs on gray products, right? Products that emit a lot. So steel, chemicals, those kinds, cement, have relatively low tariffs compared to, say, solar panels and bicycles. We have not thought enough, nor do we have good enough data, I think, integrated into our analysis to look at gender, MISME, and poor and underserved populations well enough to be able to tease out the trade effects compared to some of those other forces that I was describing. But I will say this, the WTO agreements are fairly flexible. You have a lot of flexibility within your own, you still have a lot of domestic flexibility in how you want to respond to these things, as long as you meet certain high-level principles. You can't discriminate against between your domestic and foreign providers. And I think but most countries don't use the agreements in very creative ways, largely because I think policymakers find it very easy to blame somebody else and to try to shift the burden of adjustment to other countries rather than to think more comprehensively about how we can solve these problems. However, things like climate change, health policies, you need this kind of global cooperation, and there may be some problems with some of the underlying principles of the WTO. So for things like a green transition, do we just want to treat steel, no matter how it's produced, the same? Or do we want to be able to differentiate between how the product is produced? And frankly, those things are now coming to Geneva with a fair amount of resistance from poor and developing countries. But those things are coming to Geneva and starting to be debated and discussed. And very recently, you may have heard about the TRIPS waiver negotiations and a compromise there around intellectual property to address a particular COVID health crisis, which indicates that there are ways to do this. It's not easy, but I do think that the WTO and multilateral trade agreements do provide a potential venue for helping to solve some of these problems from the trade side. But you can't expect trade to be the magic bullet. You've also got to have domestic policies that reinforce it. Let me stop there. Sorry I took so long. Thanks, Amrita, for the opportunity to share some of my thinking.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you for highlighting the importance of national policies, the role of safety nets, and setting that within the context of the WTO. Before I ask Alan to respond, I'd like to also invite Dr. Razzak for response to Alan's presentation. Over to you.
Chair, thank you so much for inviting me to this discussion here. As expected, it was an extremely thought-provoking presentation from Professor Winters, and who has been, we all know, a pioneer in this kind of academic work. And also, like Robert Koopman's insightful comments and perspectives, I believe have provided some ideas how difficult it is and some of the issues that are under negotiation in the WTO. What I'm going to do in my discussion, I'm going to deal with, I think, 2 or 3 more kind of global trends that we are now looking at, and some of the questions that policymakers, particularly from the developing countries, they are trying to address. And I would like to ask international trade economists, especially academic economists, and including Professor Winters, IDS, and others, to do a bit more work in that direction to give them some advice or informed inputs into the process. So the first point that I would like to make is this: what we are observing now, a kind of shift in the significance of international trade in the global economy. Between 1985 and 2008, which is the global financial crisis period, we have seen the share of global exports in global GDP increase rapidly from 18% to from 16% to 32%, double. But since then, either it has stagnated or has started declining. So that has been one concern. And now we know the problem is the export GDP ratio measure is not a good measure because GDP is a measure of value added. Exports are not. But this is being seen as trade losing the stem of as engine of growth. So that is a concern is coming up quite significant, especially if you look at the trend for the large developing countries, then it is quite prominent. Apart from amongst the large developing countries, apart from Vietnam and to some extent Mexico, I think all countries have seen their export GDP ratio falling quite significant. Just for China, from 36% to 18%, India 25% to 18% over the past 10, 12 years, Indonesia 41%. To 25%, and so on. Okay, even for countries like Malaysia and Singapore, they have seen their export GDP ratio falling quite significantly. Now, we have also seen countries pursuing proactive policies these days. Make in India, Made in China 2025, America First. These are nothing but kind of a move that would perhaps say that there are other things to think about when we're talking about trade as an engine of economic growth. Now, in the above circumstances, and also you have seen the WTO multilateralism is stalling. So the question for us, then somehow we need to start mentioning or discussing the significance of international trade, in bringing efficiency, in promoting welfare gains, in promoting total factor productivity in certain cases, which is good for economic. I think that discussion will become important, especially for making policymakers in developing countries convinced about some positive role that trade can play. Of course, it's not a silver bullet, it has been pointed out, but I think the good side of the trade we should also be mentioning those issues. Second issue that I would like to mention is this. Now, how international trade is going to impact a country's growth and income distribution, poverty, employment. I mean, it depends on country-specific circumstances, trade policies, initial situation, as mentioned by Professor Alan Winters. However, there are also certain structural factors that we need to take into consideration, especially participation in global trade has now become extremely difficult. LDCs, the least developed country share in global trade is just about 1%. This is one of the missed goal of the sustainable development goals that we have seen by 2020. That sure was supposed to rise or double, but that didn't happen. Now, multinational enterprises, they account for more than 2/3 of global trade. And now how we can establish our relationship with MNEs are not clear. There are some cross-country economic evidence showing some variation in MNE participation in trade by countries. But to be honest, again, we're talking about the average. A large or a lot of variation remains unexplained. And that's where the problem is, because the developing country policymakers, they try to find it difficult to understand, how to get into the global value chain or kind of, M&E network. Now, the other issue is with the global value chain, many countries, who are even successful within the developing countries, they remain stuck at the bottom of the value added, as you have all known. And this smiley curve that we all familiar with, where we can see the asymmetric value generation along the global supply chain. And over time, this particular smile curve has become steeper. So that means even the manufacturing process as part of the value chain add only so little value. In fact, there are some statistics to tell us that Vietnam, for example, in clothing, its domestic value is just about less than 20%. Now, if you think about some of the preferences, that are being given and the rules of origin requirements for the least developed countries, typically it is in the range 25% to 30% value added needed, to qualify for those preferences. So we can see the extent of competition, and many people are now saying that one can only benefit from the current kind of global value chain led trade if a country can expand its volume very fast, otherwise it is almost impossible to participate effectively in global trade. And that is what is hindering many of LDCs and low-income developing countries' participation in global trade. So I think that is something we need to think about. Another issue also, we're now seeing currently, although when we talk about the policy mechanism, we tend to think that in a country is going to either cut tariffs or make some adjustment so we can identify what is proactive trade policy measure. Not necessarily. Consider Bangladesh and Vietnam. In textiles, Bangladesh has done relatively well, but it has become one of the most closed economy in the world if you compare the average tariffs of different countries. Now, the fact is, consider the Vietnam, the way its export GDP ratio has gone up, is now 300 and I think $36 billion, which is more than 100% of its GDP. And consider the fact in 1990, Bangladesh and Vietnam, they had the similar level of exports, just about $1.5 billion. And since then, Bangladesh had just moved to $40 billion, Vietnam to $336 billion. Compare their growth rates, both the countries are more or less have achieved the similar kind of growth rate. And in fact, Bangladesh has managed to have overall GDP bigger than Vietnam. Well, maybe Bangladesh has got much larger population than Vietnam, but if you would do the same kind of comparison with the Philippines, then you will also see that despite Vietnam's fast expansion in international trade, its GDP remains smaller than the Vietnam. So one question is, if exports are so successful in generating total factor productivity gains and many other spillover effects, then why that GDP growth has not peaked the way we would have liked to see in the context of Vietnam? I think that is a question that policymakers are asking because they want to pursue certain kind of goals in promoting their GDP growth. Now, Amrita, I think the final important point that I would like to make here is the nexus between trade and poverty, but also how technology is coming into the field and making a big impact. And we're already seeing some profound impact taking place because of the trade and technology nexus. I can give you one concrete example. In the year 2010, Bangladesh exported only $12 billion worth of ready-made garments, apparels, only 12, 1-2. 10 years down the line, immediately prior to the COVID shock, the exports, ready-made garment export was $36 billion, which is 3 times higher than 2010. But if you would think about the total amount of employment associated with the apparel sector, then virtually almost nothing changed between 2010 and 2020. So that is why the automation and the role of technological promotion, and now the policymakers are asking the question, then what is the benefit of having this kind of trade when you cannot ensure employment generation? That is coming up quite strongly. But also, if you would look at the trends in the global economy, Bangladesh still uses pretty much labor-intensive process. So $1 million exports in the clothing still employs around 142 labor. For Vietnam, that $1 million exports of apparels is associated with just about 50 workers. So as you can see, over time, maybe Bangladesh is going to move into that direction if it is going to be competitive in the global economy. So we're going to see maybe trade would increase, but the employment, we're not going to see that employment impact is going to be that effective. And I know.
Thank you so much, Dr. Razzak. I think that was really that raises quite a lot of issues in terms of significance of productivity, technology, and especially for LDCs. Since we've not got too much time on our hands, I'd also like to add in there, Alan, a question based on the questions that I've seen posted. If, based on, of course, all of that food for thought, you had to highlight 2 really critical messages on inclusive trade, especially for its impact on poverty, what would that be? So you've got 5 minutes to respond. And sorry, that's going to be a challenge, but over to you, Alan.
Okay, thank you, Amrita, and thank you, Bob and Razak, for both of you have made lots of important points, and indeed 2 messages. Well, that really puts me on the spot. I will try and come back to that. I think, in a sense, I don't really disagree with very much that either Razak or Bob has said. I do think the evidence on trade and the long-run growth rate is still somewhat ambiguous. I wish it were different, and I can certainly see how it could be different. But pinning it down requires monumental amounts of data. If we think about trade reforms, they take 15, 20, 30 years perhaps to bed down. You don't have very much data. It's very difficult to pick out what is accelerated growth during a transition period up to a new steady state equilibrium from a shift in the equilibrium. In some sense, that is the $64,000 question. Plenty of people observed. If you can put 0.25% on a country's growth rate, you will do miracles for its level of income, in 50 years. It's just the arithmetic of compound interest. So I do think it's something that we really should be working on, and I certainly don't at all disagree about the possibility. I think the question of using trade policy to address other sort of trade, other elements of distribution or climate change, it seems to me that in a sense that what one needs to do, ideally, is have a really clear idea of what you are trying to achieve domestically. And then ask, well, let's at least make sure that trade policy is not rowing in the opposite direction. The great problem that we face is that the link from trade policy through to gender empowerment or climate change is typically rather tortuous. And as Bob alluded to, there are people who have interests in this process, and these are often quite powerful interests, and they pop along and they explain to you. And then they explain to the minister, and then to the press, and so it goes on. And how you protect the processes that sort of ensure that trade policy is being used in a selective way, as it were, in a perfectly legitimate way, is very difficult. And I think the only defense against it is that we have really explicit views from government about what they are trying to achieve, and therefore why trade policy is the appropriate instrument. But I do think, again, it's a very important issue. And certainly climate change is very clearly going to rub against the trade infrastructure, really, very soon. And indeed, lots of us are starting to work on that. I think to turn to Razak, look, I think it's exactly right that, the excess growth of exports relative to GDP is over. My own view is that that's because the global value chains are not expanding anymore, that the growth essentially was, to a reasonable extent, sort of double counting, because we were fragmenting production. We were counting this stuff several times as it contributed. And therefore, that per se should not be alarming us very much. However, to connect it with sort of protective policies, reshoring and so on, again, that's where, in a sense, we need real protection against letting policy get, if you like, diverted by other interests. I think the position of, when I worked in the World Bank, we were very, very focused on this question about, here are these value chains, how do the least developed countries, but even low-income countries, get part of that, get into that. Partly, we think it's to do with domestic reform and so on, that in some sense you need to be attractive to getting into those things, but that's clearly not a sufficient condition. You need some luck, you need some focus, And in this case, you probably, if you're a small developing country, need to be prepared to bet on this sector rather than that sector. You can't be in the GVCs for everyone. You know, actually, you're going to do cars, and let's hope cars work out, something like that. I think the statistics you quoted on Vietnam and Bangladesh about the growth of their trade and the growth of their GDP, it's really interesting. I hadn't particularly thought of this as a, you know, as a dimension, but it really highlights what Bob was saying. That I think I was perhaps hinting, but you know, do say under other circumstances, you know, trade is just part of the story. Vietnam, you know, has had wonderfully open trade in the sense of really boosting exports. It's not handled its domestic economy so well. These state-owned enterprises were sort of declining in importance, and now they've come shooting back their very strong interests. And that almost certainly, I would guess, is what's holding Vietnam back. Bangladesh, in a sense, is much more, actually, I think, like a market economy. But I think getting inside that question is a really interesting growth question. It's the question is, what causes the growth? And, you know, is trade necessary? Possibly. Is it sufficient? Certainly not. And I think that, you know, so I think that's a really interesting sort of shopping list that you came up with. My two messages, I think, if you really force me into a corner, it's very unfair to force an academic into a corner like this. But I think the two things I would say are the following. One, it's difficult. Down at the lower levels where we are concerned about the impact on real people, you know, trade reform as if people mattered, it's detailed stuff. You cannot avoid collecting data, thinking hard about it, and analyzing. Don't expect trade to solve real problems. Don't expect any trade-specific trade policy not to have adverse impact somewhere. But be aware of what they are. Look at trade policy as a whole package. People who lose here might gain there, and think about companion programs to perhaps redistribute, perhaps retrain, and so on. That, I think, is the first thing. The second thing I would say, becoming rather less popular, I think I see in the world, certainly in Britain, is to say mobility matters. The idea that here I am with these coordinates of latitude and longitude, and in some sense the world owes me that I can have a standard of living like I would have in Manhattan, and if you're not delivering that in Vanuatu, you are failing, is the wrong mindset. You know, actually what we need to do is to recognize that we have to help people take advantage of the changes and protect them with safety nets and what have you when they can't take advantage or they're actually harmed. So I would focus very much back on the mobility issue. And that really goes beyond trade policy. It's to do with ethnic tensions. It's to do with, can you get your kid into school if you migrate to the city? You know, what's the housing market like? And all sorts of other things like that. So it's monumentally difficult. But I think that's how we get the benefits of trade shared out. And in fact, by moving people from less productive to more productive circumstances, we probably get, you know, a bigger pie as well. I've probably exhausted my time, so I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Alan. So, and thanks everybody for joining us. So, trade and poverty, what is it that we know? I'd like to say we know a bit, or in fact quite a lot, but we do need to ask many more questions on trade, but also on the role of accompanying national policies, but also for the long term on structural change that can help us better think about inclusive trade. And I'm glad we've made a start today with excellent contributions from our panel. And I'm sure this will be a very good basis for us to continue the debates and discussion that will help us understand better inclusive trade. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Alan, Ritzak, and Bob, thank you for your time. And thanks for everybody who joined us live as well as on Zoom. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Bob and Razak, nice to see you.